My name is Pat Brereton. I'm from the School of Communications in DCU, and I specialise in environmental communication. And I've been writing about farming for a good number of years, and farmers and farming. And so I'm very looking forward to this discussion on grassland ecosystems. We would encourage you, as we've encouraged in these conversations, to take part and put questions up on the chat. And we will try to get to as many as we can at the end. We'll be recording the presentation, and I will ask you to keep your cameras and sound mute during this part of the proceedings. My colleague Mike Jones will be note-taking for the session, and let me introduce then our speaker. Matthew Saunders is an assistant professor in plant ecophysiology in Trinity College Dublin in the School of Natural Sciences. His research addresses the global challenge of climate change by investigating the role of the terrestrial biosphere on climate feedback systems. Using an integrated experimental model-based approach, he studies the effects of land cover, land management, disturbance, and climate on the exchange of carbon, water, energy, and other radiatively important greenhouse gases between the biosphere and the atmosphere. This work allows him to quantify the relative warming or cooling effect on ecosystems can have on the atmosphere, to better understand the drivers of carbon and greenhouse gas dynamics, and to help develop sustainable land management tools that are centered on the role of terrestrial ecosystems in the mitigation of climate change. A mouthful, fascinating stuff. So I'm going to hand over to Matthew to give his presentation now, and we'll have some very good discussions afterwards. Over to you, Matthew.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pat. Can I just check, can you see my screen? Can you see the slides? Are they in presenter mode? Yep. Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you today. As Pat explained in the bio there, much of my research really focused on the role of the terrestrial biosphere in the whole kind of climate discussion, whether or not, how particular land cover classes and how we use those land cover classes essentially have a net warming or cooling effect on the atmosphere. And so today I'm going to focus the talk on some of the contextual issues surrounding grasslands, and put that context into play in terms of the role that grasslands play in terms of emissions and climate forcing, particularly from the Irish perspective. I'm going to cover a little bit in terms of the research that we've been undertaking in collaboration with some of the main partners such as Teagasc, to look at the kind of emission scenarios from particular grassland systems, and then focus a little bit on the sorts of solutions and where we're going with this kind of subject in the future. So just to put this into context, if we look at grasslands in Ireland, and if you look at kind of the proportional area that these grassland systems cover, it's a really important land cover type ecosystem in the Irish context. It covers 61% of our land area. And what's also important to remember is that these grasslands are distributed across a really wide climatic gradient, different soil types, and are also subject to different management intensities in terms of how we use those grassland systems for agricultural production, for example. And this is important because this then has implications for the carbon stocks within those systems, and also the exchange and fluxes of carbon and other important greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxide from this particular land use sector. Look at this, if we look at how grasslands and agriculture in particular, play a role in terms of the climate discussion, particularly in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases from agriculture. This is some of the information that was compiled really nicely by Eamon Haughey, who I think has spoken on the series before. But you can see that it's a really large kind of sectoral emission from the national perspective in Ireland. Contributes about 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and that's substantially higher than the EU average, which is around about kind of 10%. If we think about agricultural emissions in the climate mitigation process, and if we look at the climate mitigation plan, for example, there are targeted emissions from each sector, including agriculture, of about 30% from 2005 levels by 2030. Just to put that into context, thinking about where our emission dynamics are going, in 2018, the emissions stood at about 22 megatons, and that's about 8% above the emission levels in 2005. So, you know, this puts into play the role that agriculture can play in the climate mitigation piece, and the sorts of activities, particularly from the research perspective, that we need to kind of, you know, I suppose, investigate to better figure out and quantify, well, what are the emissions and how can we then start to reduce those. When we're talking about emissions from agricultural systems, we're really focusing in on, you know, kind of, you know, two key gases there that really, as you can see from the graph there, constitute the majority of the emissions. So this is methane that's emitted from the livestock process, either through the animals themselves or through manure management, and also the emission of nitrous oxide from fertilizer use and soil management. And, you know, those are the two kind of dominant, you know, emission pathways within agriculture. But we also need to think about, you know, the role of carbon there as well, in terms of, you know, kind of land use and soil systems, in terms of the emissions of carbons, but also how these systems can actually assimilate and sequester more carbon in terms of the climate mitigation piece. When we look at trends over time, we can see that, you know, and one thing I think is important to mention here is the efficiency of the agricultural systems in Ireland, which, you know, there's lots of literature out there that really highlights just how efficient, in theory, and sustainable these systems are, but they still have an impact on the environment in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and the emission trends, as I mentioned earlier, are increasing. Even though efficiencies are increasing, we're seeing an expansion in the sector and intensification of particular kind of, you know, agricultural systems, which is then having a knock-on effect in terms of emission trajectories. When it comes to understanding the carbon and greenhouse gas dynamics of the systems, are really quite complex. They're complex because we need to know the stocks that are in the systems, in the soils, in the vegetation. We need to understand the emission then, or the exchange of gases between the biosphere and the atmosphere, how much carbon is assimilated through photosynthesis, how much of that is sequestered in the plants and the soils. How do the soils and the soil characteristics play a role in the carbon stocks? How does it influence rates of nitrous oxide production and emission? And we can see how this changes, you know, in this kind of schematic here, when we look at the soil type or the management intensity from intensive to less intensive. We need to think about the drivers of emissions as well. How will climate change affect this? How will rising atmospheric CO2 concentrations affect the productivity of the grass systems? Things like atmospheric nitrogen deposition, will they have an influence on nitrous oxide emissions from soils? And all these sorts of things need to be considered when we think about the emission scenarios and the carbon stocks and greenhouse gas emissions from these sorts of ecosystems. Now, if we think about the soils, one of the first things we really need to kind of consider are the sorts of soil characteristics that we have and how that relates to the carbon stocks. And we can see here quite nicely, here you can see kind of the classic soil textural triangle. And what you can see here is that, you know, when we move away from the sandy soils to the soils that have, you know, that are kind of, you know, have a higher clay content, higher silt content, we can see that the carbon stocks in those soils are increased. This is because the carbon is protected within aggregates within those soil systems. And it also suggests that it allows us to better understand where we might be able to identify or target areas that we can enhance rates of soil carbon sequestration in these systems. It's also important to think about soil characteristics and soil carbon stocks across the entire soil profile, not just in the top part, kind of, you know, 30 centimeters of soil, which is the most kind of biologically active and the one that is most influenced by some of the management interventions associated with agriculture, but right across that soil profile. And you can see here some of the estimates that have been in a recent publication that have been put together to really indicate the significance of the soil carbon stock within mineral soils. Now, this obviously pales in comparison to the carbon stocks associated with organic soils. We'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. But again, it's an important point to consider. And understanding this, understanding the characteristics, understanding the soil carbon stocks and how it's influenced by the soil type, for example, allows us to start thinking about future, you know, kind of management interventions that can help increase carbon stocks within soil systems. So here again, some recent work that's been undertaken in Teagasc and also in Trinity here by colleagues, and also AFBI in Northern Ireland, that show that, you know, perhaps if we were to look at full inversion tillage during pasture renewal, we can shift the carbon stocks within the soil profile and actually bring lower carbon content soil up to the surface to then increase its soil carbon content, increasing the total amount of carbon that's held within the profile at a greater depth. What they've also done in this paper, which I think is really important from a strategic perspective, is identified, where are the most suitable places that we could do that. So all of a sudden we have a potential solution that can be applied at scale in order to try and increase the carbon stocks of grassland systems. Now, as I said, it's not just carbon stocks that are important to consider. It's also really important to consider the exchange of some of the more important greenhouse gases between the system and the atmosphere itself. And there are kind of two key ways we can do this. In kind of figure A there, you can see all of the kind of the high tech kit that's associated with the eddy covariance flux towers that are used. And on the right hand side there, you can see the static chambers that really capture the kind of the soil point-specific soil-derived greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it's important to use both of these techniques in tandem to help constrain the carbon greenhouse gas budgets of particular ecosystems, but they both have particular benefits, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in some of the following slides, which highlight some of the research that we've been doing. And the first slide you can see here is one of the experimental sites down in the Chagos Johnstown Castle Environmental Research Centre. You can see a map there of some of the paddocks that we've been working on, the grassland systems. The red dot is one of the eddy covariance flux towers. Those kind of squiggly lines around it represent the footprint, the area that flux tower sees. And the blue dots then are the kind of static chambers that we've used. And what we've really been testing, because lots of the emissions that we report are derived from emission factors derived from chamber-based measurements, is to better understand both the differences in emission profiles in both space and time to make sure the sorts of numbers that we're reporting, are kind of really kind of robust and accurate. So what we've been trying to do here is to see whether or not, using both these bottom-up and top-down approaches, do we see, kind of an accurate estimate of things like nitrous oxide emissions from grassland systems. Here you can see some of the really important information that's come out from that slide. On the left-hand side, you can see a kind of a cumulative time series graph that shows the rate of nitrous oxide emission over time from both the eddy covariance tower in the blue line and also the chamber-based approach in the yellow line. The good thing there is that we can see they're in agreement, but what we can also see is that the flux tower really captures those differences in the baseline emissions, but also the management-related emissions as well. Really important to be able to characterize those, because obviously, the chamber-based approach is, it's a lot of time investment, but there are gaps between those measurements, and so we have to model and interpolate between those lines. The eddy covariance tower then gives us those sort of continuous baseline information that allows us to kind of, better constrain the fluxes and also try and reduce the uncertainty somewhat. Where the chambers really come into play is when you look at the information on the right-hand side of the graph, because we can use the chambers then to actually develop emission factors for particular emission sources within the agricultural setting in grasslands. So we can then constrain the emission factors that are associated with emissions from urine or dung or particular fertilizer approaches as well. That's really important because that helps us develop strategies to better implement in farm management practices to try and reduce emissions in certain situations and perspectives. And again, it's important to make sure that we're measuring these sorts of things in the long term at a range of sites, because you can see, if you look at the emission factor graph on the right hand side, you can see that the emission factors for particular constituents or sources of nitrous oxide from this particular study differ to those that are taken from the literature. That's because of the site-specific nature of the measurements we're making. So we need to make sure that we've got, a range of different soil types, land use systems, climate systems in this mix to better constrain the fluxes and the emissions from these systems. One other thing that's really quite important as well is that at the field scale, using this approach in this particular project, we've been able to assess the kind of the full field scale net carbon greenhouse gas budget under different management practices. So we ran the experiment for a couple of years, one when the field was under a silage management, one when the field was under a grazing management, and then we can start looking at the differences in those components of the carbon greenhouse gas budget to figure out whether or not the system's acting as a net kind of a source or sink of carbon and greenhouse gases, and is it having a net warming or cooling effect on the atmosphere. And what you can see here as we move from the left to the right hand side of both graphs, anything below that line, anything that's negative is basically uptake by the system, has a net cooling effect. Anything above that line is released from the system, having a net warming effect on the atmosphere. So you can see the role that plants play in assimilating carbon and drawing CO2 down from the atmosphere if you look at the magnitude of the NEE value, the net ecosystem exchange of carbon. You can see that that value changes between the two graphs, because obviously with the grazing management, you have cows that are continually consuming the grass and the grass sward, for example, whereas you have one large export or a couple of large exports depending on the harvest frequency in the silage event. You can see the difference in terms of nitrous oxide dynamics in that yellow graph. There are more dung and urine patches in the grazing system, which is creating hot spots and also hot moments of nitrous oxide emissions. There's also an increase in methane emissions because you have cows in the field. So this accounts for the methane that's produced when the cows are on the field there. But anyway, as we come, the kind of the story behind both of these graphs really shows that, you know, under these particular managements in this particular setting, this particular system acted as a small net sink of carbon. So I think that's really important to stress, that, you know, some of these systems under these particular types of managements do act as a small sink at the field scale. The issue comes obviously with the wider farming practices, when we have, you know, emissions from, you know, cattle housing and manure management that then would start to shift field scale dynamics a little bit, you know, differently to these sorts of numbers. But I think at the ecosystem scale, it's really important to constrain whether or not these systems are acting as a source or sink of carbon. The story differs, though. I mean, obviously we've been focusing on mineral soils over the last number of slides. The story differs somewhat when we look at organic soils. And I know Flo has spoken on the session before about peatlands and the role that organic soils play there. But there are, you know, 300,000 hectares of organic soils under grassland management in Ireland. That's quite important. That's about 29%, 30% of the total peatland area. And from a kind of a carbon greenhouse gas perspective, this is, you know, again, important in terms of a climate mitigation piece, because these types of soils, and the soils in Ireland essentially, are a source of CO2, and this is because of the emissions that are coming from the drained peat soils. Again, it's an important part of the kind of net CO2 emissions from Europe, you know, with about 20% of the CO2 emissions come from drained organic soils between 1990 and 2010. There are a few studies out there, you know, undertaken by Dave Wilson and Florence Renaud Wilson, looking at different sorts of grassland systems under the EPA-funded Callisto project. And you can see some of those numbers there, Glenfarre and Laneborough. The differences there between those numbers were really the depth of drainage, the nutrient management. And, you know, we've been working, you know, under a DAFM-funded project, AgriSoc, with Chagos, using the Fluxtail, you can see in the picture there, looking at another one of these sites and adding some more data to that mix. And what we're seeing from the Lullymore site is very, very similar. All of these systems, the grassland systems under organic soils, are acting as a source, having a warming effect on the atmosphere. And so we're kind of trying to think about, you know, from an experimental perspective, what we can do about that. And there's a lot of talk, you know, in terms of some of the mitigation options, in terms of, you know, rewetting these sorts of grassland systems. And that's something we're trying to, you know, to assess experimentally using the setup you can see here as part of the same project. And here we have lysimeters of peat soils from the grassland systems that you've seen in the last image from Lullymore. And what we've done there is we've essentially re-wet these cores to different depths under the IPCC drainage classes, and we're measuring the carbon greenhouse gas emissions and the productivity from those cores. This is still a work in progress. This is something that was started this year. So again, the point there is that we are, you know, experimentally trying to better understand the implications of these sorts of potential mitigation options for grassland systems. And what are the other opportunities, you know, within these systems to mitigate emissions? Well, you know, the first thing to look at, I guess, is the management and the management interventions and the sorts of emission savings that can be made associated with different approaches. So looking at the number of cattle in the field, looking at the stocking rates, looking at the NEE data that we have from the Johnstown Castle site, thinking about harvest frequency and grazing frequencies. Thinking about the sorts of nitrogen that we apply. You know, there's lots of recommendations there from shifting from particular nitrogen, you know, products. You know, protected urea, for example, can mitigate emissions in certain aspects, and how we apply that and how that's applied in a more, tailored and specific, method in relation to the system that we're looking at. I've already mentioned before, looking at kind of reseeding options, looking at different kind of grassland mixes, bringing legumes into the mix as well to enhance nitrogen fixation and reduce the reliance on other nitrogen sources. The deep inversion one is a really, it's kind of, one of the more frontier approaches, one of the more, kind of cutting edge, approaches to think about how we can increase carbon sequestration across the profile. There's the rewetting aspect that I've spoken about there. And there's also this concept of carbon farming. Again, all of this then needs to be kind of, built back into kind of, the policy mechanisms to provide, the right platform to allow people to, to apply this at scale. We also need to think about targeting hotspots of carbon, looking at the map that we showed there that's highlighted the potential for deep inversion. We need to look at where are the really strong sinks of carbon, and we need to protect those. We need to make sure they don't lose any more carbon or lose any carbon, anyway. We need to also identify, well, where's the kind of the low-hanging fruit? Where can we really ramp up carbon sequestration in these sorts of grassland systems? Looking at things like soil textural approaches, looking at the agro-composition of soils and the protection of carbon in the long term within that soil profile. And this will have benefits. If we can increase soil carbon stocks, particularly in these sorts of grassland systems, it's going to have both agronomic and environmental benefits, not just the climate piece, but it will help with, soil fertility. It will help with keeping water within the system. That in itself has inherent climate adaptation benefits, thinking about productivities. But also it's important to think about, that we can't do this everywhere. It's not going to be a single solution that fits every single scenario. You need to consider the site-specific factors. You need to consider, as we've mentioned before, the differences in climate and soil type and the sorts of intensive management in play or that could be in play in a particular location. And also we need to consider the other ecosystem benefits. It's not just climate. We need to think about climate and how that, solving that solution can also help with biodiversity status, that can also help with water quality and things like, nitrous directives compliance, all these sorts of things. Also importantly, one of the most important factors is how does this all make sense from a socioeconomic perspective? That is, somewhat outside of my area of expertise, but it's a really important point to consider to make sure that we're having this conversation, this just transition type conversation that we've been having with peatland systems in the agricultural sector to make sure the implementation of these sorts of solutions has the right net benefit for everybody involved. One thing I will say, just and this is the last I just finished up with, is that I'm quite optimistic, in terms of kind of developing future solutions. We're seeing this really collaborative, development of networks and projects that are really kind of working together to try and solve these sorts and come up with solutions to solve these sorts of issues. This is, largely in the remit of Chagas, and they're doing some really kind of fantastic work, the stuff that Gary Danigan's doing, the stuff that Carl Richards is doing, and the sorts of, kind of areas they're working on leading down in Johnstown. But things like the National Agricultural GHG Centre of Excellence, looking at how we can mitigate methane emissions, but also, more importantly, the coordination of this sort of kind of greenhouse gas research, so that we have a really important platform and database that can be used by a range of different individual stakeholders to help solve these problems, but also to disseminate the information, to provide the outreach that allow people to really understand how best to implement and enact these sorts of solutions. One thing that will really help with the development of things like emission factors and our emission inventories is the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory. This is going to look at the kind of the carbon sequestration potential and greenhouse gas emissions across a range of grasslands, both in relation to management, in relation to soil systems, and we'll also look at have a particular focus on the peat wetlands. So it will build on the work that I've mentioned in terms of AgriSoc, and there's a new project coming down the line in terms of it's called Carbosol, that will have a whole range of flux towers really dedicated to answering these sorts of questions at the field scale. It's important to look at the catchments program. That's really focused on water quality in recent years, but now that's been expanded to include GHG research, which again is really important in creating that integrated solution to these sorts of issues. And also the signpost farm. There's a whole range of farms that will be sampled to assess the impacts of soil type on climate and land use, and also management on soil carbon stocks. It will give us a really useful picture in terms of baseline carbon stocks. It will give us a useful picture in terms of the implications of current management and also the interventions that can be put into play there to help increase carbon sequestration. All of this then integrates with other national networks. It's important to, to mention that the work that the All Ireland Climate and Biodiversity Research Network, the Irish Soil Water Content Monitoring Network, ICRAG2 that are looking to develop an observatory island, the Terrain AI network, all of these projects are now working together to really help inform, both the emission scenarios from benchmark sites, but also the application of potential solutions. And we have a face out to the wider world as well. So these sorts of flux tails will be engaging with ICOS, the kind of European Integrated Carbon Observation Network, that's really going to feed into and actually showcase the sort of work that we're doing, the sorts of solutions we're kind of coming up with in terms of the grassland systems in Ireland. So I'll finish up there on that positive note, and I will open the floor to questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. That was really informative and very engaging. We can turn off the recorder now. And the big thing is